Welcome to Green Fashion Dialogues, the official podcast of the STARS project. I'm Simona Vettore, junior expert in circular economy and your host. STARS is part of the Erasmus Plus program, co-financed by the European Union. Today, we are pleased to welcome back to our podcast Alessandra Lopez y Royo, also known as Alex Bruni, academic, activist, and model. In this new episode together, we will revisit a topic we touched on previously, the issue of Eurocentrism and neo-colonialism in today's fashion system. While this might sound like a technical subject, tied more to geopolitics, it actually has very real connections to the development of small local brands, both in Far East Asia and in our own peripheral areas, far from the major cities where the main fashion weeks takes place, and where the most well-known luxury and fast fashion brands are headquartered, imposing their own global standards. Eurocentrism and neo-colonialism affect not only the flourishing of local designers, but also the environmental, economic, and social impacts of fashion production. Let's dive in and discover more about this important issue. Welcome back, Alessandra. It's a pleasure to have you as our guest again on the podcast. Even though this is our second episode together, would you mind briefly going over your background for our listeners?
Hi, Simona. I am really excited to be here today. Once again, it's really a marvelous opportunity. I have introduced myself in the first podcast, but I'll do a very quick recap for those who are joining us for the first time. So, I was born and raised in Italy, and I moved to the UK before I turned 20 to pursue my studies. And that move eventually led me to settle in London, although I've done quite a bit of traveling across Europe and beyond. My heritage is a mix. There's some distant Spanish influence, which explains my long Spanish surname. I do use the name Alex Bruni as well, but only in some contexts. So I earned my PhD from SOAS, that is the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of the University of London. And I specialize in a combination of archaeology and anthropology. I would say of myself that I'm a writer, a fashion activist, and occasionally I also model. And you could say that in a way the modeling connects with the fashion activism because I am an older woman, an older model. So I'm trying to push a diversity agenda and sort of I'm quite concerned with the issue of representation. But we won't go into that today. So, for several years, I taught visual culture and performance, focusing on South and Southeast Asia at various British universities. My interest in fashion grew from my work in visual culture. Then, in 2013, I took early retirement to focus on my writing and research full-time. My first book on fashion, published as part of Bloomsbury's Dress and Fashion Research series, centered on contemporary Indonesian fashion. And that book, supported by funding from institutions like the British Academy and also École Française d'Extrême-Orient, which offered me a fellowship at the Jakarta office. So that book was published in 2019. For my research, I spent several months in Indonesia exploring its fashion landscape, which built upon my earlier studies of Indonesian art. So I already had a familiarity with the region. It's just that I kind of changed my research topic. So this book is quite important because it will serve as a reference for today's podcast. As you know, I recently published a second book in the same Bloomsbury series, and this new work focuses on fashion, sustainability, migration, and embroidery, exploring the Solidarity Atelier. So in the first podcast, we discussed how these ateliers are pushing for social inclusion through an economy of solidarity and sharing. So we will not be talking about that today, but I'm just trying to draw some connections.
Thank you for that recap, Alessandra. Your experience and background are fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners appreciate this perspective. So let's jump right in. As you mentioned in our previous episode, we talked about the recent book and shared with our audience the story of social atelier in southern Italy. We also briefly touched the issue of neo-colonialism in the fashion industry. Today, we'll have the chance to delve deeper into this topic, drawing from another one of your publications titled Contemporary Indonesian Fashion, which is based on your field research. Why did you write a book on contemporary Indonesian fashion, and what is the main message behind it?
Okay, I wrote the book to challenge the Eurocentrism embedded in the concept of global fashion. I wanted to question the hegemonic and homogenizing discourses around beauty and body image, as well as the outdated ideas of tradition and modernity, and also the ideas of center versus periphery that dominate fashion narratives, particularly in the context of developing countries, or rather the global south, as we would say today. These concepts often carry colonial and neo-colonial undertones. So when I started my research, many people asked why I chose Indonesia. I mean, most people in Europe and or in America think of Indonesian fashion either in terms of its textile craftsmanship or as a derivative of Euro-American models, European models. Some may view it solely through the lens of Muslim or modest fashion, modest wear, which is just one facet of Indonesian fashion overall. Others recognize Indonesia mainly for its low-wage workers manufacturing clothing for Western brands and the poor working conditions. However, despite their concern for these workers, there's again little acknowledgement of Indonesia's own thriving fashion scene. Indonesia is a rising economic power, and fashion being one of its fastest growing industries when I conducted my research, which was between 2015 and 2018. Indonesia made for a fascinating case study on its position within the global fashion landscape. So my book critiques the Eurocentric and ethnocentric biases deeply embedded in fashion discourse. Fashion from developing countries, from the global south, is often dismissed or written about with condescension, as though creativity and innovation were exclusively Euro-American prerogatives, which I argue is an inherently racist assumption.
Let's start by clarifying some of the key concepts. Eurocentrism and neo-colonialism are central to understanding the dynamics within the global fashion industry, especially in relation to countries outside of Europe and North America. Alessandra, could you briefly define these terms and explain how they manifest in the fashion world?
Okay, I'll try and be succinct here. Eurocentrism is the practice of viewing the world through a European lens, often assuming that European culture, values, and norms are superior. I mean, here when I say European, of course, I mean Euro-American or even Australian, basically all the cultures that have been fashioned, that have absorbed European cultural values and norms and have been fashioned that way. So in fashion, this means that Euro-American designers, trends, aesthetics are often considered the global standard, sidelining diverse cultural expressions from other regions. Neo-colonialism refers to the continuation of colonial power dynamics in a modern contemporary context. There may not be the political domination of earlier times, but it is definitely an economic domination. In fashion, this shows up when Western brands exploit resources, labor, and creativity from countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America without fairly compensating or crediting them. It also includes the appropriation of cultural elements without understanding or respecting their origins. I mean, an example of this could be the explosion of Japonism and chinoiserie in haute couture, taken, out of context, and also a certain maison that for a long time would not acknowledge the contribution of, say, embroiderers from other parts of the world. It's only in very recent years, for example, Dior acknowledged, I think it was 2 years ago, or a year ago even, when they went to Mumbai and they had the input of a local school of embroiderers. They finally acknowledged their input. But say a couple of decades ago, or even just 10 years ago, that would not have happened. And that is part of this cultural appropriation, really. So both concepts, Eurocentrism and neo-colonialism, reinforce global inequalities in the fashion industry, perpetuating dominance by Western countries at the expense of non-Western cultures. The two concepts are, in other words, interconnected.
Thank you for that explanation. One thing that stands out when discussing Eurocentrism in fashion is how deeply it ties into the legacy of colonialism. During the colonial era, Western powers didn't just impose their cultural standards on the regions they controlled, but they also extracted resources and labor, shaping the very foundation of what we now call global fashion. These patterns of exploitation persist today in many ways. For example, fashion-producing countries in the global south continue to face significant environmental challenges due to unchecked production practices that lead to pollution and the depletion of natural resources. This mirrors the extractive behaviors that began during colonial times.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And also economically, the dominance of Western brands stifles local markets, making it hard for designers from these regions to grow and compete on a global scale. Instead of nurturing local talent, these markets are often flooded by mass-produced Western clothing, which pushes out local creativity. And finally, culturally, we see the continued imposition of Western beauty standards. Colonialism didn't just reshape economies, it also reshaped identities, and in many ways this legacy remains. Many communities still feel pressure to conform to Western fashion ideals, losing touch with their own traditions and heritage. Given this, how do you see the impact of Eurocentrism and neo-colonialism shaping the environmental and social realities in the Indonesian fashion industry? And in what ways is the Indonesian fashion system responding to these pressures?
Well, you've given a very, very good sort of recap of what it really means from a historical point of view, what colonialism and neo-colonialism, how they are connected. Now, coming to your question, I would like to backtrack a little. I wrote this book on contemporary Indonesian fashion precisely to highlight such responses. Indonesian fashion is complex and multifaceted. For a time, in the Euro-American context, it was discussed primarily in terms of hijab fashion, modest wear. And that was framed as in the writings of some scholars as a mode of resistance. Now, this is one aspect and certainly an important one. And I'm not denying that hijab fashion could be seen as a mode of resistance. However, hijab fashion doesn't represent the whole. Indonesian fashion is much broader than its modest wear. And this is a very important point that I wanted to make through my book. As I conducted my research, several sub-themes emerged, from beauty standards to the design process, fabric production, sustainability or understandings of sustainability, and the Indonesian fashion industry as a whole. My focus was on contemporary fashion, particularly the fashion that grew after Indonesia's reformasi period. Reformasi refers to that period that followed 1998, when the Suharto regime, the new order, was toppled, and so Indonesia again regained its democracy and also freedom of speech. There had been a lot of censorship in the past. And also this was a time when an impetus was given to the creative industries. They blossomed. Before this, Indonesian fashion, of course, it did exist, but it was heavily influenced by colonial categories and national dress policies. The national dress policies were very much part of the Suharto's new order. So while Indonesian fashion today is certainly a product of globalization, nevertheless it still resists and reflects these globalizing forces in its unique way. It's not a linear narrative, but a multifaceted one, shaped by both local and global influences. I think that here we need to take heed of the writing of post-colonial theorists like Gayatri Spivak or Homi Bhabha, who describe this as post-colonial mimicry, where subversion and ironic self-orientalizing take place within a modern, globalized framework.
You highlighted how Indonesia's fashion scene is frequently reduced to stereotypes or ignored altogether, despite its growing influence and unique contribution to the global fashion industry. Building on this, I'm curious, what aspects of the Indonesian fashion system do you see as comparable to other so-called peripheral regions?
Okay, so once again, I will repeat it. My book explores the contradictions within global fashion, mirrored through contemporary Indonesian fashion, hence the subtitle, Through the Looking Glass. I highlight the absences, the silences, and erasures in fashion discourses which Indonesian fashion reflects back and magnifies. You could easily substitute Indonesian fashion with fashion from any of the so-called peripheral region, as my goal is to question precisely these concepts of center and periphery and the hierarchy of fashion capitals, with Paris at the top, and then London, New York, Milan, sometimes Tokyo, but this is the fashion that matters according to the people who write about fashion. It's a very Eurocentric perspective, Eurocentric view. Occasionally you may have Seoul in Korea thrown in because, of course, it's a very, fashion is also blossoming in Korea. Anyway.
Yeah, that's true. Even if we recently starting to heard about fashion weeks in South Africa, in Hong Kong, so maybe something is moving. You mentioned that Indonesian fashion mirrors the contradiction inherent in global fashion. Could you elaborate on how these contradictions are reflected in the Indonesian context?
Okay, so Indonesian fashion is encased in the global framework of a fashion discourse dictated by the Euro-American fashion system. Yet, as I said, it is inflected in an Indonesian way. That is the subversive mimicry that I mentioned earlier. So we have in Indonesia the whole apparatus of fashion weeks, showrooms, pop-up stores, fashion magazines in print and online, which are greatly influential and mediate ideas of style and beauty, and the whole system of fashion consumption, which is tied to the shopping malls and also, now more than ever, online shopping or e-commerce. So we have a push towards valorizing indigenous crafts and textiles, and to some people in Indonesia, this seems to be enough in terms of sustainability. And at the same time, we have the large viscose manufacturing plants, and until not too long ago, Indonesian workers were employed on less than the minimum wage to make clothes sold by major fashion brands, by which I mean Western ones, with a mix of luxury and high street labels. Now, this is not so much the case now because, as you know, these brands, the fashion industry is always looking for cheap labor. So it kind of moved from Indonesia elsewhere. And now actually what is happening, here there's something that connects to my to the earlier podcast. What is happening is that in the global north, in developing countries, the exploitation, the cheap labor is provided by migrants and refugees, and then people who, don't have their papers and are exploited in these workshops, which might be on the outskirts of large cities like Milan or London or wherever. So whereas earlier, there was this move towards going to countries where they could get cheap labor, and that still continues. I mean, think of Romania, think of Morocco, earlier it was Indonesia, a bit less now in Indonesia, but Bangladesh and so on. But also, back home, there's a whole pool of labor that can be exploited, and the fashion industry does that. So when we come to the wearers of fashion, especially women, there is on one hand, and now I'm talking again about Indonesia. So when we come to the wearers of fashion, especially women, there is on one hand the construction of an ideal, aspirational urban wearer, and the realignment of the clothed female body with a constantly changing imaginary, a hegemonic discourse on beauty predicated on slimness and fairness of complexion. That is very important, to be fair. And on the other hand, a growing alternative tendency within Indonesia, whose goal is a disruption of oppressive beauty standards. And this actually is happening elsewhere globally, this counter-discourse, if you like, and that counter-discourse is present in Indonesia too. So I was very interested in just looking at, the different facets and all the contradictions, if you like, that are reflected in the Indonesian context.
Yeah, it's really interesting how Indonesian fashion manages to navigate between local and global influences while reflecting and resisting these larger forces. Given your extensive time spent in Indonesia during your research, could you describe what the fashion market there looks like today? What kind of stores do you encounter? Are they mostly dominated by the big Western brands, or is there space for local designers? And are there any major Indonesian or other Asian brands that remain relatively unknown to us here in the West?
It's an excellent question. It's something that I actually decided to include as I went along. I decided to include a section on the malls precisely because, there is an internal hierarchy and the malls are a microcosm that allow you to understand the workings of a fashion. The malls are dominated by Euro-American labels. You go to the ground floor and you only see, big fashion names. And of course, there is a hierarchy among the malls themselves. There are the high-end malls, and then there are the middle ones, and there are the lower end. So the high-end malls, they would have on the ground floor, you go in, take, for example, Plaza Indonesia in Jakarta. You go in and what do you see? Alexander McQueen, Louis Vuitton, and so on and so forth. And then you move up to the first floor. There you might find Indonesian labels, but you will never find them on the ground floor. The sort of middle-ranking malls, again, they will have a Zara, Marks and Spencer, and then you go up and you find Indonesian labels or maybe Korean labels and so on. The lower-end malls are just places where you buy, counterfeit Prada bags, or you buy very, very cheap fast fashion from China. So the malls are public spaces where you will find predominantly middle-class people. And actually access to a mall is, not everybody can go in. People have to be suitably dressed. There are security guards. So if you've come straight from the village and you're wearing, a sarong or flip-flops, you can't go in, especially men. Women can wear traditional clothing, but it has to be rather tasteful. And so you have to wear, you have to be properly attired to enter the mall. The malls are also a place where people can they don't necessarily buy, they can enjoy air conditioning. And there are restaurants where they can eat food that actually you will find it's sold much more cheaply in the streets. But, in the mall, you have the advantage of being seated and have somebody that comes to serve you. It's part of the whole, it's the whole performance, if you like. So now Indonesian designers, they do sell mostly in their own showrooms or in pop-up stores or in galleries. Like, for example, there is the Fashion First gallery in Jakarta where you often have a fashion show, a small fashion show, or a fashion installation, and then there are sales connected with it. Selling in malls is actually, the problem with malls is that the rents are very high. So not all designers are willing to invest so much money in it, but some do. Of course, bear in mind that my research covers up to 2018, and many things may have changed And I'm sure that now the online, the e-commerce is much bigger than it was back then, although it was only a few years ago. However, I believe that the malls are still there. I don't think that they've disappeared. So I don't know really what the latest developments are, but basically this is very much they are very much a fixture.
That's such an interesting reflection, Alessandra, and in some ways quite a sobering one. Your mention of post-colonial mimicry really highlights the complexity of how fashion evolves in such contexts. This leads me to another question. Considering the dynamic nature of fashion you just described, is there still such a thing as traditional fashion?
Oh, that's also a great question. Thank you for asking. Okay, the answer is both yes and no. I mean, earlier in the academic discourse on fashion and dress were seen as separate categories. While traditional fashion exists, but it's not static. Traditional fabrics, embroidery, and other elements are continually being recontextualized and incorporated into contemporary fashion. Also, I need to point out that traditional fashion is not necessarily eco-sustainable. It all depends on the dyes that are used, which may not be natural ones. They may be chemical dyes. I mean, yeah, sometimes, of course, except perhaps when making a few specific items of clothing, which can be very expensive. They are, if you like, the equivalent of haute couture. So, the idea basically is that traditional fashion is also continually evolving. So we shouldn't think of people being locked in a sort of timeless tradition, because that's definitely not the case.
You mentioned also the importance of questioning concepts like tradition and modernity in relation to fashion. How do these concepts, often laden with Eurocentric biases, influence the perception and representation of Indonesian fashion and other non-Western fashion systems?
And that's why I ended up writing my book. Like I said, many people outside Indonesia believe that Indonesians only wear traditional dress and that everything modern is derivative. They also believe that modernity was ushered in by the colonizers, and it wasn't the case. It was a combination of so many different factors. It is a well-known trope. If we talk about art, for example, the idea of a non-European modernism still sounds alien to many. It is a complex discourse of authority, hierarchy, and power. Anthropologist, fashion scholar Sandra Nissen wrote over 20 years ago that fashion scholarship acknowledges fashion as quintessentially Western. Elsewhere, people do not wear fashion, they wear dress, locked in a timeless tradition. And it is a statement that 20 plus years on, still holds true. Many people still believe that.
Let's introduce another concept, that is decolonization. Decolonization in the context of fashion goes beyond merely including different clothing systems within the history of contemporary fashion and recognizing them as contemporary fashion that fits within the Euro-American norm. Instead, it aims to restore, reevaluate, and acknowledge a diversity of ways to dress the body, along with their stories, genealogies, and aesthetics. It is not about erasing differences, but rather about dismantling inequality, disdain, and denial. The rejection of modernity as a horizon of expectation should not be confused with a backward or traditionalist perspective. Rather, it should be viewed as a firm stance for autonomy and dignity, and as a radical departure from the historical horizon of Eurocentrism and Western dominance. Decolonizing fashion requires a critical rethinking and realignment of systems, practices, and ways of thinking in the fashion industry. It means dismantling the systems of exploitation, oppression, and appropriation that have been inherited from the colonial era, and creating a more equitable, just, and sustainable fashion system. This process involves recognizing the limitation of the Eurocentrics worldwide, amplifying the voices and experiences of other cultures, and striving to build a more just and inclusive future for all. What do you believe are the concrete actions that designers, companies, and consumers can take to challenge Eurocentrism and promote greater social and environmental sustainability in the fashion industry?
Well, thank you for that sort of introduction to the concept of decolonization in relation to fashion. I think it's very important to sort of put it like that, very succinctly. Now, in answer to your question, I think that acknowledging diversity and implementing knowledge exchange, that's one of the steps that can be taken. Understanding that social and environmental sustainability are only possible through a communal effort. And so a respectful attitude is paramount. I say through a communal effort, but of course, social and environmental sustainability are also an economic and political issue. And so you do need the intervention of governments. It cannot just be done as a kind of alternative on the fringe. Otherwise, it will remain so, an alternative on the fringe. And then, the fashion system will continue as it is. And we need, a concerted effort of different powers, a true mobilization. I have addressed this topic more fully in my book on the social atelier and the economy of solidarity and sharing, and we have discussed it in the first podcast, so I will not repeat myself here, but I think that this is quite important. I am also a little wary of the fact that we tend to refer to ourselves as consumers all the time. Yes, we are consumers, but I guess we are a lot more than that. We are people. And I think that this way of seeing things will also help us to shift, the hegemonic discourse. So we're not just consumers, we are people. And we need to acknowledge our diversity and sort of be respectful of each other's, origins, cultures, views, rather than just looking at the relationship only in terms of consumption and monetary exchange.
Yeah, thank you for this powerful message. To conclude our conversation, I'd like to turn to the final chapter of your book. Can you share your thoughts on the theoretical framework presented in the final chapter of your book and how it sheds light on Indonesian fashion as a reflection of the broader global fashion landscape?
Okay, so the final chapter of my book on contemporary Indonesian fashion is quite important because I do discuss then the theoretical framework underpinning my research. It's like, you turn a garment inside out and then you can see the stitches and the so-called invisible stitches and the stitches proper. And that would be really the theoretical framework of my metaphorical garment. So I draw from Entwistle, who in turn draws on Bruno Latour, to describe fashion as a series of heterogeneous actor networks composed of both human and non-human elements. So I analyze Indonesian fashion as an assemblage of these networks, looking at production, mediation, and consumption. So production would be the design as well, the mediation as you find it through the media, the magazines, the online publications, the blogs, which, where and the bloggers were very active a few years ago, perhaps a bit less now because blogging is not so much in fashion. And then the consumption, and that's where I focused on the malls and what happens in that microcosm. And revealing how the Indonesian fashion system reflects the flaws and contradictions of global fashion. I mean, it's all really... I always bear in mind that dynamic. I have also deployed as an analytical tool the concept of fashion as performance, with reference to Richard Schechner's analysis of performance as an individual and social behavior and as a personal and social interaction. So I've done so when considering fashion shows, for example, the performance of fashion. And in a way, that's quite predictable, if you like, because for many years I taught performance. I taught about the study of performance. So, that was a milieu I was rather familiar with, and rather familiar with the theorizations of performance studies scholars. I also consider the experience of wearing clothes as a second skin, using phenomenological approaches to make sense of the embodied experiences that I describe in detail in the book. And additionally, talking about the wearers of fashion, the people who wear fashion, and fashion as the clothes as second skin. And additionally, I explore the notion of the gaze, but as it has been reformulated by Anneke Smelik in relation to fashion, and particularly with reference to the internalized norms for an ideal body, thin yet strong, that pervade media representations in Indonesia, but also more globally, that ideal body that we're constantly presented with, and we need to compare ourselves with to see whether we match it. So my ultimate aim with this book was to challenge the monolithic view of fashion as a universally applicable Western model, and I've used Indonesia as a case study. So fashion is plural and diverse. It is articulated through a series of overlapping and sometimes competing systems, and basically that is the overall message.
Thank you so much for your valuable participation, Alessandra. Your deep reflections have truly enriched our understanding of these complex issues in the fashion industry. It's been a pleasure to have you again on this podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona, for inviting me to talk again about my fashion experiences, both in Asia, in Indonesia, and also when I did my research in southern Italy and Morocco. So it's been for me wonderful to be able to share my views, and I really look forward to comments and suggestions from our listeners. Thank you again.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Green Fashion Dialogues. We hope you will find our discussion insightful and inspiring. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a review. You can also follow the STARS project on social media to stay updated on our latest initiatives and events. Remember, together we can make fashion more sustainable and inclusive. Until next time, I'm Simona Vettore, and this has been Green Fashion Dialogues.